Onslow Heath as I rode o'er, I spied a lawyer going before. Kind sir, says I, aren't you afraid of Turpin, that mischievous blade? Oh, red Turpin Hero, oh, red Turpin, oh.
The Hopeless Highwayman. This is Stanley Boot. Stanley lived with his mother in a small cottage on the outskirts of a village. Stanley was a bright young man who could make something of his life, if only he could work out what that something was. See, Stanley was a dreamer, which meant that he could imagine himself doing all kinds of work, but never get round to actually doing any of it. Stanley had one main passion, and that was reading books. He could spend all day sitting at the table, stuck inside some adventure story or other. His eyes would glaze over as his mind took him into each story, and he became the heroic character, fighting battles and rescuing young ladies. One day, however, he was shocked out of his particularly exciting daydream by his mother's angry voice. "Stanley Boot, I've had enough of you and your daydreamings. Get out there and find yourself a job." Stanley knew it was best to do what Mother said, so he shrugged on his coat and went out to look for a job. But where do men go to find work? I know. There are usually a lot of men in the village inn. I'll try there. Looking at this new task as something of an adventure, Stanley entered the first alehouse with a feeling of excitement. The inn was called the Salter's Rest and was filled with men who were finishing off or just starting their shift in the local salt mine. Our young adventurer purchased a small lemonade from the bar and edged up to a group of men listening to a tale being spun by a white-faced old miner. It appeared that this old fellow had been salt miner, man and boy, but gave up the work, vowing never to return after one night of terror. His wide-eyed and hushed audience listened as he recalled one evening as he and his mates were returning to the surface. He had to go back to pick up a forgotten shovel, only to find it missing. Without notice of time passing, he searched for it until suddenly all the lights in the tunnels dimmed and then died. He was left in pitch blackness. And soon lost his way trying to return to his mates. The man went on to describe what happened next, but this would be too terrifying to relate now. Enough to be said that the man finished his tale. "And the next day they opened up the mine doors to discover me shivering and mumbling with me in once jet black hair, completely white." Stanley hurried out of the inn, quite sure that he didn't want to be a salt miner. At the other end of the village was another public house, called the Boatman's Knot. This place was frequented by canal folk. Now, a life of open-air adventure as captain of your own boat. That sounded good. Another group of men was sharing tales, each one more bloodthirsty than the last. Tales of giant water rats and falling overboard into an underwater kingdom, with just two of them. Poor Stanley was about to make yet another swift withdrawal when he caught sight of two dark-eyed lads sitting in a cosy nook by the fire. The two smiled at Stanley and waved him over to join them. They laughed when he told them of his search for a job and the experience he'd had. "You don't need to work like that to earn great riches," remarked the hairier of the two. They proceeded to tell Stanley how they earned a living by arm wrestling. It appeared you could offer a free pint to anyone who could beat you in an arm wrestling match. They offered to give Stanley a tryout to see if he was strong enough to be champion. Each time he won, he would gain a free drink. Stanley was a bit surprised that neither of these two young lads could beat him. After having his mug refilled for the 5th time, Stanley felt a little dizzy. His 2 new friends offered to help him outside for some fresh air. Stanley couldn't remember much of what happened after that. The 2 rascals did help him outside, but then helped themselves to his coat, his hat, his shoes, and his purse. He woke up later with a cracked head and a cracking headache. Stanley's mother was not too sympathetic and told him off for allowing himself to be tricked by a pair of highway robbers. Well, that was a thought. I'll be a highwayman. Stanley's first efforts were not too successful. Unable to find a pistol, he had armed himself with what looked like a pistol on a dark night. Unfortunately for him, the first person he held up laughed out loud and then grabbed the banana and ate it. Stanley made sure that the next time he would have the real thing. But even with a pistol he didn't do much better. The first coach he stopped was carrying an elderly couple. Excuse me, could you give me some money? He asked very politely. The lady and gentleman were very cross and told him that Stanley Boot would be in real trouble from his mother if she knew that he'd been begging at the roadside. How did they know who he was? Stanley decided that he needed to find out more about being a highwayman. He went to the village library and found a good book with pictures. It showed him how a real highwayman behaved, what he said, how he dressed, and what adventures he had. That night, a heavily armed masked figure stood in the shadows beside the high road, waiting for some victims. It wasn't long before 2 came by. "Stand and deliver!" To Stanley's amazement, these were the very same 2 ruffians who had robbed him that day outside the inn. And now they were grovelling before him, begging him not to be shot. Another surprise awaited Stanley. The 2 were carrying the fruits of a month's robberies in the area. When Stanley the highwayman sent them on their way, minus their wealth, a coat, a hat, and a pair of shoes, he had enough to retire from his job. Later, Stanley had a really good idea. He'd enjoyed reading about highwaymen, and that library was very warm. I think I'll become a librarian.
Says Turpin here, ne find me out. I've hid me money in me boot. The lawyer says there's none can find the gold taped in my cloak behind. Oh, Turpin Hero, oh, Turpin, oh. As they rode by the powder mill, Turpin commands him to stand still. "Kind sir, your cloak I must cut off. My mare, she needs a saddle cloth. Oh, Turpin Hero, oh, Turpin."